Are we live?
We're live.
We're live! Welcome to the Black Sheep live stream. It's me, Salomé Sibonex, co-founder of the Black Sheep, with my second half, also co-founder of the Black Sheep, hence the co. Introduce yourself.
Klein.
Yes. And we are going to discuss the thing that everybody's discussing, but in a way that not everybody is discussing it, because to be frank, I find it disgusting the way that people are discussing the Luigi Mangione alleged killing of the UnitedHealthcare CEO. There's a lot to get into, which is he a terrorist? And if he is a terrorist, is terrorism then justified at some point? Because a lot of people seem to think so. Are these people correct? Or are they sadistic people who enjoy seeing their political enemies murdered? Could they be both? So we got a lot of questions. And of course, what implications does a good sizable group of people who feel that this is justified, what implications does that have for a classical liberal society? And so I want to get your thoughts as well. So we're going to develop this discussion and make room for you to give us your thoughts on this. So let's talk a little bit about the basics in terms of what happened, what we currently know, and what the landscape is of this issue. So I'm no expert in crime, murder, and the news, but I do consume these things, sometimes against my will. And this is one of those things that was largely against my will. I would rather not be engaged in this discussion, to be honest, because the reason we're having this discussion is because of, like many of us, you've seen people really cheer on a murder. And that calls for discussion. So here I am, instead of talking about art or flowers or doing all the nice things I like to do, we got to talk about whether terrorism is ever justified. So you brought up to me, Jake, that Luigi is classified as a terrorist by the definition of what terrorism is, rather than just like a random murderer.
I think so. There's a lot of different definitions for what terrorism is. And it's a very politically loaded term because, if you label something terrorism, even if it's, some sort of freedom fighting action or whatever it may be, it gives it a very negative political valence. But what terrorism is, I think, at its root, before you think about whether it's good, whether it's bad, is it's a tactic. What it is it's the engagement in some sort of illegal, violent crime for the purposes not just of the crime itself, but for inspiring fear in the broader population to then bring change. Luigi is, I believe, going to be charged with terrorism in New York State. So he's a terrorist, according to New York State's prosecutors. And it seems pretty clear to me that that's what he intended to do. He didn't want this to just stop with Brian Thompson and UnitedHealthcare, but to inspire change in the health industry as a whole, to raise awareness and bring people to action. And I'm not saying that murdering somebody to do that is worth it. I absolutely don't think it's worth it, and it's very disappointing the amount of people that are cheering this on. Polling shows that a plurality of Americans under 30, 41%, think that this was a good thing, as opposed to 40% that don't. Those numbers of support drop off a lot when you go into the upper age ranges. But nonetheless, that's extremely concerning. That's extremely concerning to know that that's the next generation that's coming up, and many already politically active adults feeling this way. So
the youth love murder. Okay? And there's movies about this also. I think there's old horror movies where it's like, what if the kids tried to kill us? Or the children of the corn. There you go. The classic kids love murder film. So there's themes there that we can get into. But I want to briefly. Do you want to fix Instagram? I mean,
there's no fixing it. So there's 2 of us on camera today, and we just can't fit all of that into a vertical Instagram thing. So if you're watching on Instagram, come join us on YouTube, where you'll be able to see both of our faces. What do you want me to do? I can end the Instagram stream, or we can just let it go with no picture of us.
Okay. I just didn't know if there was a way for us to maybe just have one here. Does it have to crop it in the middle like that? It could just be one of us instead of this avant-garde scene here.
We would have to change a bunch of
Okay,
things.
well, we're just going to leave this avant-garde scene on Instagram, but for those of you watching on Instagram, yes, we know it's just a mic and my arm, so we recommend you go to another live stream channel and catch us there where you can see us. So let me get that out of my face because it's distracting me. So anyway,
we're also live on X, so
we are.
Watch us on X too. We're live on X, Rumble, YouTube, and cropped into being invisible on Instagram.
All right, fun times. So, what I want to talk about is that I don't like that people were cheering the murder and whatever. So, as of right now, Luigi is the alleged killer, or he's been charged and with terrorism in New York, which is crazy. It's okay, confirmed terrorism thing. So, this is the interesting thing about this situation. And so it leads us to ask if a lot of people are into this and they do think that this is justified on different levels. Well, is terrorism ever justified? If you have this situation where people feel like an industry has become stagnant and exploitative and it sounds like we have ghosts in the background. I don't know if that's audible to people, but it's cats, as always. The ghosts are just cats running around. And so what I've seen is a lot of people that I don't think have thought that hard about it. And I think those are the people that that are cheering it on. Yeah, he's our icon. He's our folk hero. He's our anti-hero. Come to the rescue against the evil capitalists. That kind of rhetoric, those people are not thinking that hard about it to begin with, to be okay, well, is it really justified? But the reality is, we should think that hard about it. We should actually think through it because that's how you reason through premises, is to make sure you're actually in line with your values and, the implications of the positions you take would lead to the kind of society that you want. Not just I like the vibes of killing a CEO or, I hate healthcare anyway, so I don't care that much. What if we actually thought it fully through? So we discussed this a little bit in terms of, is terrorism ever justified? And I really fall on a almost always never situation because for me, we don't live in the kind of society where you have absolutely no recourse and where terrorism is your absolutely only recourse. And part of the reason I've been disturbed by people cheering on the murder, besides the obvious reasons that I think it makes your heart black and hardened, and I think you should be very wary of when you find yourself casually savoring the murder of someone that you don't actually know in a case that you haven't even actually taken that much time to look into. You just heard, oh, healthcare CEO got murdered? Yeah! That's a Rorschach test. That is projection entirely. That is assumptions of who the killer is, who the victim is, why the thing happened. When you have all that kind of assuming going on and such an emotional reaction, that's all you. That has nothing to do with the actual situation. And that's a cause of concern. Now, I think that we don't have this kind of situation, despite the fact that, yes, of course, both of us recognize that the healthcare industry is fucked and that the insurance companies are problematic at best. But that doesn't mean that murder is the only answer. So what do you think about this, in terms of whether or not... Stop it! Stop! Oh my God! Can you... Someone tell me if they can hear the cats, because if they can hear the cats, I'm gonna yell at them. But if they can't hear the cats, then I look crazy because I'm just yelling at nobody. But anyway, what do you think about this being justified or not?
I basically agree with your take there. I mean, I think you have to resort to something like terrorism. And I see we have a question from Anna on YouTube. Like, what makes this terrorism and not just murder? Well, because it was it was done to inspire broader fear. We've seen fear amongst other healthcare executives. Blue Cross Blue Shield already changed a policy that they were going to enact about coverage for anesthetics over a certain period of time.
Maybe.
The companies...
We don't know if that was necessarily because of that. Did they come out and say, we don't want to get shot? So
no, of course not. But it was right afterwards. And all of these companies have taken down the names of their executives from their websites.
That's so crazy.
So if there was any mens rea, any like intentionality, which it seems that there was, in getting that reaction, then that would be terrorism and not mere murder. It's politically and ideologically motivated, using fear as a tactic. I put together a 3-pronged test for what I think would make terrorism justified. And I think that it can be under certain conditions. So I'll read out what that is.
You have a terrorism test you made?
I mean, this is my thought on the matter. Okay. You would want to ask first, will the act of terror be effective? Let's say that you're an environmentalist. There's been all sorts of eco-terrorism in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. All right, well, if you really believe that the world is going to end, I mean, we would want an objective standard for whether that's true or not. But let's just say theoretically it was. The world's going to end, and we need to raise awareness for this environmental issue and move people to our side. Well, it would still have to be effective, because if it just pushes people away from your cause, which I think we see from most domestic terrorism most of the time, then it can never be justified. Because even if you have a good political motive behind your terrorism, it doesn't work. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So then the next one would be, is the target's death morally justifiable? If you're killing innocent people with your terrorism, I don't think that can ever be morally justifiable. If you're engaged in combat with, an opposing military or something like that, but you're using guerrilla-based fear tactics, against legitimate military targets, then okay. I think that's one that gets a little bit debatable in this case. Mm-hmm. I don't think that threshold was crossed, but I could see the argument being made for, this healthcare CEO enacted policies which led to fraudulent denial of claims. UnitedHealthcare received multiple lawsuits that they've been losing over and over again. And yet they keep doing this. And when people get their claims denied, either they can go bankrupt, or worse, they just don't pursue the claim to begin with, and maybe that was needed care, and then they die. So frankly, presumably people have died because of this health insurance CEO's policy. So I think you could argue that a target like that would be morally justifiable. But even if it was, the third prong would have to be that, was this the only possible way to achieve change? This was successful in raising awareness for this cause, but I definitely don't think that it was the only way or the right way, that everything else had been exhausted. There were lawsuits being filed for continuing issues. There is the political process. We just can't have, in my view, this be our dispute resolution mechanism, even if the other two prongs were satisfied. In a liberal society, we have to go through the courts and the justice system.
I'm sorry. What is going on here? The cat just tore off the screen out the window. Who's locked in the bathroom? What's going on?
We'll be right back.
we're back. The cats are under control. Excuse the cats situation. Anyway, so yeah, I think the main thing here is like what comes to mind for me about there being no recourse and the fact that people may have died, likely have died from not pursuing medical care that wasn't covered by their insurance or was denied or whatever, is that you could kind of turn the same argument on doctors, malpractice, not catching a diagnosis or things like that that lead to the death of people that are in situations where they are dealing with medical treatments. So it's kind of like, it's not an excuse that like, oh, well, they're just in an industry where, it's dealing with health. And so, of course, people are more at risk of dying of your actions because you're in the health industry as opposed to like a teacher, right? Like if a teacher is in a situation where the student dies, like you're probably in the wrong almost always. If a patient is in a situation where they die and the doctor is involved, it might not actually be like that kind of malice. It may be the fact that like as someone in a medical profession, some of your clients die because you're dealing with medical needs. It's a little different. Like obviously I see the differences in terms of like,
I think there's
not treating someone or something.
Differences here because we had a situation where UnitedHealthcare had double the denial rate of competing companies and was using an AI that was known to have like a 90% error rate denying claims. That's not acceptable.
Right.
That's just absolutely not acceptable.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so the problem is that like, did anyone try to sue UnitedHealthcare?
Yes, multiple times.
Right, many times. UnitedHealthcare has been sued many times.
Lost many times.
And lost many times, right.
Yeah.
So people are winning these lawsuits. But still, do we consider that then like, okay, well, then the next option is no longer successful lawsuits, but murder?
I could see how somebody could get there, but the thing is, I think that there were still other avenues. The political avenue is the next one. That should have been attempted more. I mean, I think, listen, we have a major problem with our court system. If the imposed costs from lawsuits are not enough to inspire companies to avoid the behavior that they're being repeatedly sued for. So, I'm not a legal policy scholar or anything, but we need to do something to reduce the friction costs of our court system to ensure that we can have more cases processes faster so that when people are being fraudulently denied claims, that is put a stop to right away. And as a radical libertarian anarchist, I would say that one of the major problems that we have here is government courts. Mm-hmm. We have this hugely ineffective court system and may for the most part come to just rulings, but it's slow, it's expensive. I mean, this is why many companies will resort to private arbitration instead of using the court system when they have civil disputes. But we don't have anything like that for criminal disputes. So I want a free market for courts, something that can have much faster processing speed, get you to resolutions in your legal matters much faster, more competition, more effectiveness. I know that sounds fairly complicated, the idea of privatizing the court system. I would look at the work of people like David Friedman, who's talked about a polycentric law system in a lot of detail, and also Murray Rothbard, the kind of grandfather of anarcho-capitalism, has also talked about that.
Well, love that, because I'm sure that is a curveball that many people in the audience have not heard of, the idea of privatizing the courts. But that's the fun thing about a lot of libertarian ideas, and especially anarcho-capitalism, is that it gets you to reassess assumptions that we hold very dear without having ever truly thought through why we hold those assumptions about what should be solely run by the government, and why, whether or not that's actually a good idea. And I always think that's fascinating, because it's like people have these real emotional attachments to the idea of like, no, how could you ever have a court system not run by the government? It's like, why not? And then it's just like, usually it's just an emotional reaction. So let's deliberate here. Do either of us feel that this attack was justifiable?
No, definitely not, but I'm probably 10% closer to thinking it was justifiable than you are.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's my thing too, is I don't feel like it was justified. I think it's like, I understand the motive. And I think that's something that people have not had nuanced points on, where it's like, you can understand, you can even sympathize with like the frustration or the rage at this industry and this particular business too, without saying that, and thus the act is justifiable, thus it's good. And I think that kind of like simplistic approach has led a lot of people to just like run to the extreme of saying like, yes, this is good because I don't like healthcare as it is now. And it's like, you don't have to be in those extreme camps. So anyway, the problem here that I think is really interesting to talk through why partially we don't think it's justified, and why I actually think it's really bad that a lot of people have just kind of jumped on this train of, oh, he's a hero because we hate the healthcare industry, and thus anything that happens to healthcare people that are leading this industry is fine and justified. Is that, like everything, there are consequences for those positions. And so while in the short term, it may seem really vindicating and even exciting and justifiable that someone lash out and at this industry and murder the CEO of like a notoriously bad healthcare company, the implications of what that means for living in a liberal society where we don't just murder our political enemies are not good. And so do you want to speak a little bit about the idea of what institutions, like what role institutions play in society as opposed to just murdering the people we don't like?
It's kind of silly because it's almost like the plot straight out of a comic book. You just see this ethical dilemma over and over again of masked vigilantism. What do we do about these people that are taking the law into their own hands? And this time, he wasn't wearing a mask, but the same principles that they talk about in comic books over and over again are real. So I think that it's very important that we have an equal standard of justice, that people know what is illegal, what isn't illegal, what would be called the rule of law, and that we have trials. I mean, I might be advocating for a different court system, but I'm not advocating not to have courts. You should not have the judge, jury, and executioner be the same person. So I would like to... I just don't think you can have actions like this that are extrajudicial.
Right, because you could be wrong.
You could be wrong. You could be wrong, and you want everybody to be on the same page if we're going to share society together about what are the things, that are going to get you killed. That should be grounded in an objective morality. It shouldn't be grounded in, people's subjective whims.
Right. Or unpopularity. Because this is the other thing. There are CEOs. I mean, CEOs are broadly kind of unpopular in a culture where capitalism has turned into like this negative scapegoat where increasingly younger generations view CEOs as these like symbols of greed and forced income inequality. And so there's a really slippery slope here where, okay, we can look at this particular CEO of this particular healthcare and say, yeah, this guy seems like he was doing some sketchy, unethical, shitty shit. Fair enough. But then what if we go to the next CEO? This CEO isn't actually doing these kind of like unethical things where they're intentionally denying good claims. But they still do deny some claims because some claims should probably be denied. They're out of the policy. They're for things that seem like they're not actually necessary for the treatment. Like there are legitimate reasons to deny claims in a health insurance policy.
For sure.
Right. Well, not everybody thinks that because some people think healthcare is a human right and they think that they're entitled to whatever kind of healthcare they probably want because healthcare is a human right. So you have this kind of rhetoric, right? And so it ends up being a popularity contest at a certain point, which is the public simply hates CEOs. They're a symbol of greed. They're a symbol of denying people things that we think are rights. And thus, we get to do what we want with them. They get to be held, we are the jury, the judge, and the executioner, and they get the death penalty in the street because they're greedy and they're creating income inequality, which of course leads to some people dying also, right? Because if you're poor, you have worse health outcomes, you're probably in more dangerous situations, you don't live in a safe neighborhood, all these different things that you can make the same argument to where you say, well, this person having more money leads to death and terrible suffering for other people. Thus, we are justified in taking revenge against them. You can see how this logic slides pretty quickly to apply to people that really aren't actually as unethical as maybe perhaps the worst example of the worst is, where people are more motivated to say, well, whatever, he had it coming. Well, if we abide by that kind of logic, that's a popularity contest. That's actually rights and security and freedom allocated by popularity. And that's not a free society. That is a tyranny of the majority where you have to keep your head down because if you draw the attention of the masses, you can become the next scapegoat who's murdered simply because you are to them an effigy, a symbol of what they hate. And so that's why I really do not like the celebratory energy around this particular healthcare CEO's killing, even though I understand the guy seemed like he was running a fairly unethical business. And there are seriously malicious implications for innocent people because of that. I get and I grant all of that. Nonetheless, I find the celebratory attitude of the murder of an innocent until proven guilty person the same kind of attitude that leads to death and suffering for many other innocent people who are much less in an unethical situation like this healthcare CEO would be. And you can't have a society where people are free to live the lives they want if people are held to account by strangers like this. And so it makes me think of like the witch trials, and things like this, where you saw that people would be selected as guilty for whatever crime was decided as like the most threatening crime of the time and judged as such and executed by their own village or population because they were so unpopular often. It was sometimes like people that had, I can't remember any particular examples, but people found out that a lot of the times the people who were selected for these witch trials executions, like there were other things that made them unpopular in the village that had nothing to do with witchcraft. Just so happened that they were the ones that were selected for trial by their peers and then execution. And that's the problem. That's why we have a classical liberal society that was designed with that kind of mob mentality in mind, so that we had the freedom to be unpopular. We had the freedom to be disliked, but still we were not subjected to the whims of the masses. And that's really the energy that I felt with this, was like, there was a lot of like, the masses have decided you were guilty before you were ever brought to trial. Now, what I think is interesting is that it's kind of like an edge case also, right? It's not super, super cut and dry because, like you said, this company has been sued a gajillion times for a ton of money. And like, unlike maybe other healthcare insurance companies, this company really did seem to be practicing some unethical, I'd even say cruel policies in denying people that really had legitimate claims and just putting them through the ringer till maybe they would give up or something. So I get it on that front. And so I think what you have here is this really interesting scenario where you have in a lot of ethical philosophy, you'll construct these kind of scenarios where it's like, what if you had this perfectly difficult scenario where this value and this value were in perfect tension? How would you resolve it? How would you preserve freedom while still preserving security? In this kind of where they're really in tension with each other and you kind of have to choose one. And so I think this is one of those situations where a lot of people already recognize that the healthcare industry isn't working and that it's hard to get it to work, that there are a lot of obstacles, and like Anna mentioned in the comments here, clauses and statutes that protect insurance companies. So there's a regulatory environment that is in favor of insurance companies.
The political process, if you were to try to make the argument that there really was no other way and everything had failed, you could say that the political process was protecting... we can't do anything about the cats.
I can't do it. I'm losing my mind. They're screaming. Why is the cat screaming?
I don't know.
Is it in a closet? Why is the cat... Just put them on the mic. They clearly want to come and take over this show. I don't even know where this cat is. She's in the ceiling, just she's been screaming the entire time.
It's Charlie or Freya?
It's Charlie. Something's wrong. Something's wrong over there. Maybe she's no, that CEO had to go. As soon as we started the show, she's been screaming the entire time.
Yeah, I don't know.
I
we can stop the show and deal with it.
Is she stuck somewhere? Oh my God! Wait a minute.
What did...
I think she's in the cabinet. Where? Oh my God! How'd you get in there? She's stuck behind the laundry machine. How are you here? If you saw this, oh, dude, this is not easy. Why did you put yourself here, you fool? We figured it out. The cat had wedged itself behind the washing machine in the closet. So that is why she was crying this entire time. And I'm glad, well, maybe I'm actually not glad that other people couldn't hear it, because now it just seems like I'm neurotic, but it's way louder than it sounds to you in the audience. And I was just losing my mind with the cat screaming in the background. But she's rescued now. She's free. She's not behind the washing machine. They just do these things. My God, I just knew something was wrong. All right, let's bring it back to.
I've completely lost what we were talking about.
All right, so we're talking about how classical liberalism is designed to prevent exactly this, which is people deciding that there's no other recourse to improving an industry or a system or a process than force, than violence. And so, of course, like, this goes to the very core of libertarianism and largely what made me a libertarian, which was understanding the non-aggression principle, the idea of creating a society that prioritizes civility to the point that there is no force used against another person in order to control them. And so this is the opposite of that. This is the use of force. This is might makes right, which is like this ancient principle that civilized society was largely designed to alleviate, so that it doesn't matter if you have the most money or you're the strongest or you have the biggest army, you still have natural rights, and you have the right to live your life as you see fit and not be pushed around and controlled by those that happen to have more power than you. And so when you see something like this happen, where it's the use of force, the use of violence to gain an outcome, it's a failure of a civilized liberal society. And so it's a scary thing, because I don't actually think a lot of people realize it. And, you know, when I was younger and I was a leftist, I very much was in that camp of, eat the rich, revolution, whatever, it's cool, we gotta fight back, and that's what they get for oppressing people. You know, very much this kind of like aggressive mindset, which is just fascinating. And also we'll talk about that a little more later, because I want to talk about the psychology behind what leads people to not just be like, yeah, I understand why someone would decide to kill a CEO of a bad healthcare insurance company, but celebrate them and kind of like valorize them as like morally righteous. And so when I was in that phase, it was very much this sense that like you have to get your way by using force, and it's a dog eat dog kind of situation. And of course, I didn't understand liberalism. Like, I didn't understand the fact that you use these institutions like legislation, like court, to avoid using violence. That's what you do. Like, you use speech to avoid using violence. Like, these are the ideals of a liberal society where we solve our differences and we solve our problems in civilizing ways, as opposed to with violence. And so it's kind of like an odd thing, because you see this situation happen where people really are like, yeah, violence is the answer. And it's so funny because like there's also this long-standing ethos that says violence is not the answer. And we really seem to be coming to a part in our a place in our culture where violence is the answer is increasingly accepted, as opposed to the time of my parents where it was like, that's so fundamentally wrong. And, you know, I think it really has to do with that kind of like edgy ignorance, where how I was as a leftist, it felt like I saw through this fake nicety of violence isn't the answer. I was higher minded enough to know that that's just how they keep you in your place, man. Violence is the answer because that's how you create a revolution. And of course, like, revolutions don't often turn out very great. There is a lot of death that comes after revolution, very often. And so it's naive to think that, well, in my revolution, it'll just be the bad guys that die. Like, there will be suffering for innocent people, and that's the benefit of trying to make this system work better, as opposed to just throw it out because we've met an obstacle. And like, it's a really sad thing, because in a lot of ways I find myself on the same side as leftists now, which is that I agree the healthcare insurance industry is terrible and exploitative even, and that it doesn't serve people and that they're dying because of it. But your solutions have never worked. And I have a different solution. And so, like, if we could talk about that, but we don't even get to that part of the discussion because you get hit with slogans, which is like, healthcare is a right, as if that's just like magic words that suddenly just absolve the problem. And it's just like, that's it. I've solved it. I decreed healthcare a human right. Like, now there's no scarcity. Now there's no need to actually have a system that works. Now there's no need to account for what happens in places where healthcare is a right, where it gets rationed and where you don't actually get it when you need it and you die because of that. And so it's not like I don't understand the reasons why people see this as some kind of like positive event, but rather that's not going to work either. And I think that's what's really, really sad and scary, is that an event like this shows me how much people don't understand the philosophy of American, the America's founding, you know, like what this country was set up to do, which is to like free you from the masses, like the tyranny of the masses, and give us these civilizing institutions to solve our differences so that it doesn't just devolve into might makes right and like violence and oppression.
I will say, you know, in my research for this show, there was some terrorism in the American founding. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a group called the Sons of Liberty that engaged in, you know, various kinds of terrorism. I don't think outright murders like this. I think that wasn't so much until the war. But the idea that we are going to harm the property of British officers, that we are going to, torture them, essentially, by tarring and feathering them. And that was terror. That was to instill fear amongst the British, to get them to capitulate to the colonists' demands. Yeah. So the American Revolution was good, and you know, I think that as a country that has that history, we all kind of are maybe a little bit more prone to a revolutionary mindset. Mm-hmm. Thomas Jefferson said, you know, we might need like a revolution every 20 years and stuff like that. And it's interesting because Luigi himself was not some super left-wing guy. In fact, before he went dark on social media, like, we personally know a couple people that were in his research. Yeah. And mainstream people and libertarians, like nobody that was inspiring him to go and do this. So he wasn't some, you know, radical leftist communist. And there is a history of far left terrorism around the world, but also here in America. President William McKinley was killed by an anarchist. And what did that do to anarchists in the United States? It got them banned from immigration, had crackdowns on free speech against them. Emma Goldman was a leading anarchist thinker, was deported from the country. It did not raise sympathy for anarchists. That's what's kind of interesting about this situation, is this is perhaps the first successful case of domestic terrorism that I've found going back like quite some time. There's some edge cases of things you could maybe call successful, and successful doesn't mean good. Actually, let me define successful. So like, you know, the murder of William McKinley, that was successful insofar as the terrorist did the thing, but it wasn't successful in accomplishing the terrorist's political aims. All right? There are some other instances of things that you could maybe borderline case call successful terrorism according to their ideological aims. For example, there's been attacks against, in the United States, I mean, there's been attacks against people that have drawn cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, I'm a little intimidated against drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, even though, you know, I really believe in free speech, and I don't think anybody should be offended by that. And, you know, I have Muslim friends and I respect their beliefs, and I won't draw a cartoon of Muhammad near them, but I don't think they should, get to interfere with other people's life like that. So maybe you could call that, insofar as I'm intimidated, maybe we're intimidated, plural. But many people are intimidated from doing that. But this one, clearly, I mean, just with the way that it's talked about, the way that people are talking about health insurance, the way that Blue Cross Blue Shield backed down about one of the policies that they were going to put forward, the way that politicians are talking about this issue more. But I think for the same reasons you were talking about, that concerns me, because even though this was a successful terror event, even if you were totally for its causes completely, we just can't devolve to that process. And all of the leftists that are celebrating this, people that I think don't have as limited a scope in their goals as Luigi himself did. Luigi wasn't trying to bring about a communist revolution. He was trying to specifically stop what's going on in the health insurance industry. But the people following him that might get inspired by this, not so much. And is a long history in this country of far left terrorism, far right terrorism, Islamist terrorism, anti-abortion terrorism, eco-terrorism. And, I don't want to see this kind of kick up we're going against the corporations, let's start killing CEOs across the board sort of thing. And it's not even just classical liberalism. Classical liberalism as a dispute resolution mechanism, a way in which people with different lifestyles can all agree on one thing, which is just a certain bare minimum of human rights. The right to life, liberty, property, that's not perfectly protected in our system, but it should be. Free speech, all the things that are in the Bill of Rights. We're supposed to be protecting that, and classical liberalism does that, but this is worse than just the degradation of classical liberalism. This is the degradation of civilization, period. Because when we have people that are just kicked up into an emotional anger of just, I want revenge against these CEOs, what comes next? If you're just going to tear down civilization without any clear plan, without any limited directed goals of here's what we're organizing specifically to have a revolution for, that leads nowhere good. That even if the revolution wasn't for communism, even if it was some libertarian revolution, when it's just, we're not having either of those. We're having just this pure emotional, I hate the system.
That just sounds like rioting. That's not even revolution, that's just rioting, which is largely the point of it is to be destructive. And so that segues nicely into what I wanted to talk about more, which is just the psychology behind the praising of a murder of a stranger. And I thought it's really interesting because you have these situations where a lot is going on that is not actually logical, that is not rational, that is not even literal. It's symbolic, it's subconscious, it's emotional. And like I said earlier, one of the things that really strikes me is the fact that I know for a fact some of the people that have praised this killing have absolutely no idea any details that have to do with the case. They don't know fully what this guy's motive was in terms of whether he was bringing about a communist revolution or was just upset with the insurance industry. They don't know anything to do with the CEO, whether he was particularly responsible for bad policies or whether he just happens to be a CEO of a health insurance company.
He does seem to have been responsible for these policies. They got their UnitedHealthcare's denial rate got substantially worse after he took over.
I know, because we've looked into that after time. But I know that the people that I've seen post instantly in the aftermath did not do that. They did not know anything about the CEO or the killer or the situation. It didn't matter to them because they filled in all of the gaps, of which there were many, with their own biases and prejudices and animosity towards what they perceive as a class enemy. And so this is what I find is like really a uniquely disturbing element in some political psychology, of which I think a lot plays out in leftism, which is just like categories of people turn into these effigies, these kind of like symbols for the belief system that is leftism. So CEO becomes Satan, and killer of CEO becomes like this Christ-like figure of redemption, resistance. And then the whole context of the situation becomes one of the people fighting against the system. And that really is not what is going on many levels. Like, you have one CEO who was doing certain bad practices, but then you have a whole industry. And then within that industry is within a larger system. And like, there's lots of layers of complication going on there, but it gets flattened down into this like us versus them, the people versus the greedy rich, and all the nuance gets left behind because ultimately you don't need nuance if you're a foot soldier for an ideology that is merely seeking a violent takeover. And that's what I find so disturbing about some of the reactions to this murder, is that they remind me so much of what you would have seen in like a struggle session or like a Maoist China ransacking of a village, and like the seeking of political opponents, and like how that process degrades so quickly from people that you could say like, yeah, this is a legitimate political opponent, to the fact that like, I heard that you were not praising the communist leader. You're a class traitor. You're getting sent to the camps next. Like the psychology that's at play there is so irrational that it's merely in service of creating this division between us and them. And so like the details don't matter. And that's why, you know, we talked about this in the context of a classical liberal society, because that mentality does not want a classical liberal society, because that gives everybody sway. This kind of mentality believes that the people should rule. And of course, the people just ends up being those in power, because the people never get to finally be the ones that run anything in any of these communist regimes. That's never how it works. It's this beautiful rhetoric that taps in to the subconscious, into these like repressed kind of desires, usually of people that have some kind of impotency themselves, that aren't actually able to go out into the world and lead the lives they want. Those are the kind of people that tend to really appreciate that rhetoric of like, no, you're part of the people.
It's a school shooter vibe. It's almost like we have a country full of school shooters.
That's so crazy. Yeah, it's very irrational, and that's such a bleak picture to paint. It's very irrational.
It's not crazy though, because I mean, you look at rates of anxiety and depression amongst young Americans. You look at lack of socialization, increasing time spent online in niche communities. One's worse than ours. Spend more time in our niche community instead. And the idea, we are having more school shootings. We're having more literal school shootings. But so the idea that a perhaps like subclinical level of that attitude would become very widespread. That's not crazy at all. I think it's real.
Yeah, I think you're right because, and I want to highlight this comment by James here quickly after this, but to my mind, like there's part of like the school shooter mentality. It's not just like this individual who happened to reach this level. There's certain traits that have to intermingle, which is this kind of like animosity towards humanity, this sense of nihilism that like your actions don't really matter that much, and this belief that there is no other recourse and that force is justifiable and even a form of like empowerment. And so you can have a situation where a culture as a whole, like a collective, is through whatever means pushed in the direction of developing those traits more in mass, as opposed to like what we think of, which happens with like school shooter types, which is just like that one person had a uniquely flawed upbringing or situation that took them down that highly antisocial path, and perhaps you throw in some like severe mental illness.
You know, the data shows, and I was surprised to see this, but as I was researching about terrorism, the vast majority of people that are terrorists are suicide bombers, even completely mentally normal. You know, this idea that they do this because of hopelessness. Actually, terrorists, and this was the case in Luigi's case, are wealthier on average than the surrounding population. So it's not coming from some place of like
desperation,
hopelessness necessarily. What drives terrorism of all kinds is ideological zealotry, religious terrorism, political terrorism. Religious terrorism is actually, I mean, it's existed all throughout history, but if you go back even, I think, like 2 decades, most terrorism was secular, nationalist, secessionist movements, things like that. And Islamic terrorism has really only like picked up in the last 20 years, and so it's shifting. But
yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let me read this comment. Fundamentally, violence expressed in the context in which Luigi did is a unique form of profound cowardice. So I think that's interesting because I
disagree.
I tend to agree because,
really?
Because, you know, like, first of all, you have the classic, like, shooting someone in the back. So, like, there is already this kind of almost symbolic or metaphorical form of cowardice in the sense that you, like, have not even given this person a chance to truly defend themselves, and you are killing them when they are defenseless, like at their most vulnerable, with their back turned to you. And so I do find that is like, on that level alone, is this like archetypal type of cowardice. But at the same time, I understand that a criticism of that would be that, well, you actually aren't able to reach them in that kind of like equal footing because they're in this other part of society, because they're a rich CEO and you can't use legislation to get at them. You can't use lawsuits to get at them. You can't use all these other forms of recourse that you might otherwise do, like write a letter to the CEO and say like, hey, stop denying my claims, or, you know, like a person feels that, no, this is all I have left. And what am I going to do? Like challenge them to a boxing match or something? And then like, you know, winner takes all situation. So I understand that in this kind of, there's that criticism of it, but I do think that there's just like shooting someone in the back. Come on, that's like classic bitch behavior. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure if you're a hitman or something, you're not going to be like, well, turn around and duel. You know, it's not like you're going to do like a Wild West style duel.
If we want to bring back duels, I'm all for that. I think that's a free market dispute resolution process.
We got to bring back dueling.
Both parties consent.
Oh my God, what happened to dueling? Seriously though, like, wait a minute. We had, first of all, before anybody's, dueling, that's crazy. Our presidents were dueling. You know what is it, James? Was it Matt? What is the one that tried to make a central bank or whatever? Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. He was the one that died in a duel, which is just so, like, silly. But they were doing that. Who are we to say that we're so, dueling is so silly when the founders of this country were dueling it out? You know, that's crazy. Maybe they knew something.
I'm not
fascinating.
Gonna really advocate that. But
if two people consent,
it should be allowed. It's
If they consent to a duel, I mean, I know you can't.
I think it's a stupid
go into
choice.
contract
I think it's a
for
stupid
murder.
Choice. I mean, it's where you
it's
can
the worst
see
way to solve a problem.
Yeah, it's where you can see the extremes of an honor culture get pathological.
Right. Yeah, where they're like, well, I died. I got shot in the duel. I guess I lost.
But having said that, dueling is brave. And James, I if you want to elaborate more on why you think it's cowardice, I would be very interested to hear that. But for me, I hear this all the time about like suicide bombers. Like, oh, it's just a way out. Like, they're a coward. The 9/11 terrorists were cowards. This I just find like extraordinarily silly. There was somebody that was canceled. Like, it was Bill Maher right after 9/11 for saying like, no, they were brave when his show was on ABC. Mm-hmm. And that's how his show ended up on HBO. It was kind of obviously true, or at least obvious to me, but not something that people wanted to hear at that point in history shortly after 9/11.
Right.
So my personal opinion is, I think calling terrorism cowardly is kind of a cope. It takes extraordinary bravery to do terrorism of any kind, but bravery can be extraordinarily fucking stupid. Like, I don't think that just because it's brave that means we should be looking up to this act or any other brave act.
I mean, that's a good point, because that's one of the things about like values and principles that is nuanced, that values are meant to balance each other out, because bravery with no other value can be in the service of something bad. You can be brave while doing something stupid. You can be brave in an army who is fighting an unjust war. So you can show bravery in situations that are not undergirded by any other values, perhaps, like, I don't know, truth or something, like things like this that would help to, like, okay, I'm going to be brave, but am I actually doing bravery in service of something that's true and good?
Bravery is not enough. I'm going to take our stream off of Instagram because nobody's watching and we're not even on camera.
Okay, fine. Yeah, weird situation there. Okay, anyway, so let's move it along. So what I am thinking here, and I want to ask people questions soon, but one of the things that, how can I say this? I want to talk about spiritual warfare as an agnostic person, because this is what I have found so fascinating to me about this murder and the reaction to it, is that I see people who, like, I know, who are otherwise good people, gentle souls, like, put on this almost persona of the revolutionary so that they can signal the right beliefs to their peers, right? I'm not on the side of the greedy CEO. No, I think the killer is like the best and cool and awesome and doing the right thing. And so because it's grounded in this desire to simply show that you're on the right side, as opposed to truly think through the position you take on this and like the implications of that position and the nuances, to think about this in a way that is actually rational and productive, because it's instead it's this desire to simply like show that you're on the right side of something, and to release this kind of emotional pent-up rage you have against this symbol of inequality, this symbol of capitalism as people see it. It's not actually good. And so I've seen people kind of like rush to take these positions where it's like ever increasingly more extreme also, right? Like first was like, well, who cares? He's a shitty CEO of a shitty insurance company. And then it was like, actually, this guy is daddy. Actually, we should have more killers. Actually, the streets shall run blood red with the CEOs that we shall kill. Like, it was just like this treadmill so quickly. And this happens on social media in the most insane way because the feedback loop is just instant. So you have people who their main mode of being and engaging with things is social signaling, is reinforcing their position within their peer group. And like, I know because I was one of those people. Like, I know that that's a lot of what leftism is. It's people that don't really have a very coherent ideology, and they don't have the cognitive tools to think through positions in that kind of rational, truth-seeking way. So instead, they're concerned with finding themselves on the right team and broadcasting their beliefs. That's the whole situation there. And so it ends up like this crazy, ever-increasing competition to show who loves the CEO killer more, to the point that it's just like absurd. You know, like, you have people that it's like they're just tripping over themselves to show how much they love this murder. And I'm like, at what point do you start to lose your soul? Like, at what point do you really lose your way in the world because you're so wrapped up in signaling to a sick peer group who is also only concerned with signaling that they're on the right side, and they do so by heavily demonizing anyone that doesn't fit onto the right side? Like, you're just spiraling out of control, and you're grounded in nothing that is eternal or healthy or true. You know, it's just this kind of race to the bottom. And I think it's not like a entirely unique phenomenon. Also, it's just the basics of like, you will be the people that you're around. And so people find themselves, just like I once did, in these subcultures online where they're seeing everybody be like, yeah, I love the CEO, he's hot. We love a CEO. I love the killer. We love a CEO killer. He's hot. He's the best. He's our hero. And so it's like, okay, I am primarily driven by acceptance from my peers, and I want to be perceived in a way that I think is preferable and that they will think is preferable. What do? I increasingly signal the same things to them. Okay, you think the killer was cute? I think he's fucking hot. I want to marry him. You think the killer was correct? I think he's a hero. I think he's the best thing that we've ever had. So it's just this ramp up. And I really like, as you find yourself in these kind of unhealthy subgroups, these unhealthy subcultures online, it just gets worse and worse until these people are like kind of alien from the normal culture, right? Like, I saw this video online of people walking around trying to interview people on their opinions of like, what did you think about this killing? Like, was it justified or not? And you had like these very normal people just be like, you know, I understand that there's problems, but I don't think killing is the answer. Or like, no, I think, you know, killing someone is just always wrong. So no, I can't defend that. And then the person was like, I need to find someone that's going to justify this killing. Let's go to NYU. So they went and like they found like the wokest looking people with like the perfectly manicured beards and like weird piercings. And of course the people were like, yes, he's great. We stan. And it's just like, man, that is such a fascinating divergence from what was once the normal culture. And you see these cultural values of like, killing is bad. Killing is always bad. And we need these things because you actually, for a civilized society, you need people to have internalized this belief that killing is bad. Because if most people don't think that killing is bad, you have a very dangerous society, because not everybody that decides to turn to vigilante justice is going to pick the correct victim. Hence, why we use these kind of classical liberal institutions to make sure that before we execute someone, they truly are guilty. And that takes me to my next point. A lot of these people are anti-death penalty. So what the fuck is going on? Because I know as someone who myself is anti-death penalty, that it simply doesn't make sense for me to be like, well, I really don't like insurance companies, so kill him. This is fine.
They don't have principles, they have emotions. That's the issue.
Yeah.
So if you're have a more left liberal psychology, or let's just say left wing psychology, right? Then what Jonathan Haidt found when he studied that is they really have this very strong principle of care, of caring about other people and kindness, right? But very low in other moral traits. Yeah. So if it feels like, this person, like, he's hurting all of the American people with what he's doing with his health insurance company. I care so much about all the, victims of healthcare insurance denials. Okay, well then that appeals to you. Oh, they have this person on death row. Oh, he's guilty, but I saw his face and, he's sorry and we shouldn't do this to anyone. We need to let him off, right? You apply that same emotion to both situations and you get to completely inconsistent outcomes because they don't think from principles. Yeah. I hope that they'd be capable of thinking from principles. I'm not 100% sure if they're like a lost cause or not. But at the very least, if we want to get them to start thinking from principles, that's the kind of thing we need to be teaching people in like grade school. It's very hard to, reach people as adults and get them to kind of like reframe the entire way that they approach the world. So I think we have a big issue ahead of us.
Yeah, I mean, as a sign of hope, I was one of those people that didn't know how to think from principles and mainly thought based on emotions. And one of those emotions was just like avoidance of social faux pas or whatever, social criticism. And so it was like this desire to remain comfortable and like not become the next cancel culture target. And so that was mostly what I would choose what was convenient. I would choose what was expedient to believe, not very consciously, because maybe if I was conscious of that, I would have realized what I was doing and not do it and how it doesn't actually make logical sense. But it was more like just this, it's a weird thing because like in a way you're kind of just like this lower order thinker, like it really is just like you don't have as skilled of a means of thinking things through. And so you resort to what we naturally all have, which is emotion and these like base desires to avoid pain and discomfort, which usually leads you to seek social acceptance. And so that does like put you in these positions where you're flip-flopping on your own stated principles of being like anti-death penalty and then turning around and being like, except if you're an insurance CEO and then you can be executed in the street extrajudicially. And so I just thought that was such an odd thing to witness because it was like, well, no, wait a minute. I know that I'm against the death penalty because I don't believe the state should even have the power to murder someone because I don't think one innocent life should be sacrificed for the sake of the state being able to murder even justifiably terrible criminals. And so it was just like this quick hard stop of like, yeah, no, that means that am I going to change that for the sake of saying, well, I really dislike insurance companies. So no. So that's that. Like I retain this principle and I apply it to this new circumstance that might test that principle. And that's such an interesting thing to see people not stay consistent in such an obvious situation where it's like, but you're against people being killed for their crimes. So it's another thing of just like going with the vibes, and it's like, oh man, so much of the left is like vibe-based thinking. I know there are pockets of it that are absolutely not that, and they're like, those are like the thought leaders. But when I was in it, there were not any of those people, and I was not one of them either. So I'm going to ask people in the chat to drop down some opinions One, I want to know how you feel about the attack. Do you think it was justified? Do you think that it was not justified, and why, if you want to elaborate on that? I also think it would be really interesting for people to share, if you have the same theory that I do, that this kind of celebration around this murder is harmful for the people that are celebrating it. I'm talking about like in a spiritually sick way. I really have this instinct that it doesn't make you a better person or a more effective person to savor a murder, right? And so my thinking on this is a lot of the past war heroes and leaders that I respect were not bloodthirsty. They didn't savor their battles, their victories. It was more of this sense of, this is the best of the worst outcome. It's better we win, but it would have been the best if we didn't have to fight. And George Washington is someone that comes to mind of that for sure, because I know there was like this story of him where he was fighting a battle and somehow the dog of the other army's political leader was captured and brought to him. They're like, here's the other guy's dog. Like, this is the leader of the army. What do you want to do with his dog? And he said, clean it up and send it back to him. And I just thought it was like, it's such a sign of competence, grace, and mastery. Like, that's an actual strategic leader who's not overrun by rage and the emotion and like the desire to win at all costs, that they would take pleasure and like take that opportunity to hurt someone in a way that actually doesn't make a difference for winning the battle, right? Because killing that person's dog, that's not going to win the war. It's the dog. That would just be, in primitive times, people did do shit like that. Like, they would put heads on pikes and line them up just to show their enemies, we are so brutal, we are so fearsome, we show no remorse, we will, dominate your entire village and torture and terrorize. But then you have this like growth of awareness and consciousness in like battle psychology or whatever, battle strategy, where leaders like Washington took the opposite approach. And in some ways, I think that's more inspiring for the people that are being led by him, because they realize like, he's not out of control. He's strategic. And it's a person that like has mastered the balance between war and peace, between strategic killing and cruel killing. And like that kind of a person, you can see how it'd be so much more trusted as a leader, because they're not going to lead you into this battle just because they're so gripped by the desire for revenge against that other army or that other leader of the army. They're making decisions strategically based on what's actually necessary. So I thought that was so great. And so then you have like this other ethos now that we see, where it's like this desire for revenge, like you were talking about, like people in some regard that it's like they don't actually think necessarily that this will lead to some insurance industry revolution. It's more just like they get what they deserve. Like, this is what they deserve. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of thought is so short-sighted that it's really dangerous to follow, because you quickly see how that just ends up in this back and forth forever. Also, like, that is the ethos of eternal conflict. It's just like, I get back at you, you get back at me, I get back at you for you getting back at me. And then it's just forever in that kind of like tit for tat way. So I think my next point before we wrap up is just like why you should take a nuanced position on things like this, which is what this whole live stream was really about. Because the reason I wanted to do it was because I saw so many terrible takes, and it just seemed to me that there was such a lack of awareness around the capacity that you have to take a nuanced position on something like this. You don't have to love murder just because you hate the insurance industry. It doesn't have to be that way. And on the contrary, it's better if you don't lose your mind and heart when trying to solve a problem, because that's actually not going to make you more capable of solving that problem. On the contrary, it's more likely to cause other problems, both in that arena and in your own life. I really don't think like you can be a person that savors a murder of a stranger because of something like their business. You know, like this isn't like someone that it's like, hey, well, what? Do you think people were sad when they murdered Hitler or something? Like there's gradations to this. And I think if you don't take those gradations seriously, where it's like, the reality is that this is sad. You should be sad for all parties involved. And that's really, I think, go figure, me lecturing the empathetic left on being empathetic. But like, this is the thing with that kind of faux empathy, where it's really just empathy for our in-group, absolute cruelty to anyone outside of it. Real empathy is recognizing that this person, this CEO, made decisions that, in a way, really led to his death. And that's sad. Because I think that if he knew that, he wouldn't have made those decisions. And this killer made decisions that ruined his life. And I think there are very real potential circumstances that may render him not as clear-minded when making this decision as people might think he was. Like, it very well may be that he made this like snap decision and kind of lost his mind and has now ruined his life, and it may really not make that much of a difference, but besides being a fun day on Twitter for some people.
Remains to be seen. I think it probably made some amount of difference. I don't know what amount of difference it would have had to make to be worth it to him, but what you said there I found interesting about that. If the UnitedHealthcare CEO knew that this was going to happen, then he might not have done what he did. I mean, if you believe that, then other healthcare executives knowing that this might happen to them is the biggest change in the world. And it's the biggest successful act of terrorism domestically maybe ever.
I don't think that's going to work, though, because I don't
think it's worth it, but I think that I don't think that Luigi is sitting in jail regretting what he did. I think that like I said, most terrorists, including suicide bombers, go into what they do not because they're mentally ill, not because they've run out of options and they're hopeless or anything like that, but because they are ideological zealots. Ted Kaczynski certainly was. As far as I know, he never regretted what he did.
I feel like he's in a little bit of a different category, and I feel like there's different categories of terrorists. Like, there's people that are just like really down for the cause. Luigi seems like someone that may have had some kind of breaking moment. Considering like he went dark on social media, like his family couldn't reach him, and like, you know, there's just this kind of break from someone that seemed to have been living a really normal, functional life.
We're going to learn more information. I think it'll be interesting to find out, like, when did Luigi make the decision to do this?
Yeah.
Is that why he went off the grid? In which case, that is a very sane choice to protect his family and friends from anything to do with this, and to be more likely to get away with it. I mean, ultimately he did get caught, but you know, I think he was prepared for that. He was carrying a note on his body, basically, in case he got murdered, so that people would know why he did it when they found him. Or did something happen in that period of time after he went off the grid? Did something else cause him to go off the grid? And
Right.
whatever happened in that period led him to do this. If it's the latter, I think that will be very interesting, and I will maybe move over towards your view. But I think, again, he seemed to do this in a very sane and considered way. Like, again, to pull off a successful act of terrorism, successful by the metric of him seemingly achieving his ideological aims with the incident. That takes a lot, because very, 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 very few terrorists do that. The writing on the bullet casings, leaving Monopoly money at the park, making it out of state before he got caught. These are not the this is not the strategy of somebody that's like totally lost their minds. This is somebody that was very thoughtful, very considered, had a coherent ideological aim, and it's just that, you and we think he really, really badly got the morality of this wrong.
Yeah, and that's why I say that at the end of the day, it's a mourning event. It's something to mourn, because it's both someone that I think took the wrong approach, and someone that I think made tragic missteps in their business, and a situation for a society where our liberal institutions failed. Like, our liberal processes for dealing with these kind of differences and problems and injustices even failed. And that's sad. That's not a cause for fucking celebration. But the thing is, the people that celebrate it don't believe in those liberal institutions. And that's why they celebrate it. They want it to fail, whether they know it consciously or not. They believe in the idea of using force to get the outcomes you want. And so for me, as someone that wants to live in a classical liberal society where we don't use force to get our way, it is a sad thing. It's a tragedy, no matter how much I hate an insurance CEO or how bad I think the insurance industry has gotten. Until there's absolutely no recourse, we then have failed to use that recourse. And that's not good. I mean, I hope if we were smarter as a society, we would use that as a moment of reflection and say, hey, what happened here? Like, why did we fail to act in a civil way when we had this problem? And why did it take two people having ruined lives to recognize that there's an intractable problem here, and perhaps we're not actually functioning as a liberal society in this industry? Which is why we bring up the issue of like the overregulation and like these policies that these insurance companies are enacting, and the situation that has all together brought about that leads people to feeling like there's no recourse, even if there is actually still recourse. So I think overall, it's sad. It's sad. I find it as a tragic event, and I think that it's a tragedy on so many different levels. Like the reaction to it, it's kind of sad, dude. Like the CEO worked himself up from being just like this like working class person to like this like successful CEO, and it's like, I know that people would be like, well, yeah, by doing even evil things, but it's like, I don't, I can see someone. I don't even think like Luigi is evil. Like, I wouldn't even say that that's evil, even though I think it's so wrong. I think it's so like morally reprehensible. I can still empathize with a very human drive to do that. Like I can still understand how someone could get to the place where they feel like they're doing the right thing. And I mean, in the same way, I can understand how a CEO would run their business in a shitty way.
With almost any killer, though.
No, you cannot. there are serial killers who go around grabbing random people and putting them in vans and chopping them up. I don't feel like, I could really understand how one could.
Yeah, but that's the exception.
There are people that abuse animals all the fucking time. That is a whole thing. That they, I'm just going to put this cat in a box and throw it into the snow because fuck it.
I think
there's a bunch of crime I don't empathize with.
I think my point there is that, with the exception of true psychopaths, of which that's 1% of the population or something, and they're disproportionately responsible for violent crime, but not exclusively, and I don't think even a majority. People do everything that they do for a reason that makes sense to them. And that's the thing about the nature of evil and discussing the nature of evil that's so complicated, is that people that are evil look a lot more like us than we would like to think.
Well, that's because they're not evil. That's the problem with the evil discussion.
At that point, I think you're saying that there almost is no such thing as evil.
No, I do.
True psychopaths.
Yes. Well, I mean, the thing is, I don't think it's always true psychopaths that do things like abuse animals or abuse children, or commit rape. Like there's circumstances, or like in war when people are like, unnecessarily cruel and brutal, like in war. There are circumstances that bring out like the worst in people, and I think those are like flashes of evil. Like in a way we can become vectors of evil, like human evil, which to me is just like there is nothing left in that act that is that one can empathize with, or that is even redeemable in some way, that it's like, I understand how you could become so twisted. Like, I don't know, like even the other day I read something about like this animal abuse case where this rescue organization found actually it was my friend. They brought this bag of kittens into the rescue organization, and they were told that it was found by someone who was collecting the garbage, a garbage man, and they heard the meows, and they went to check what the garbage was, and they found a bag of kittens. Someone had taken a bunch of kittens, tied them up in a bag, and thrown it in the trash so that it would be thrown into the actual, dumpster in a landfill, and they would have died that way.
There's no shortage of stories like these. I just think that...
But I was going to say...
I just think that that's a small share of crime in its totality, and terrorism in its totality especially, and that to limit what we're willing to call evil just to people like that is, I think, over-limiting.
Well, I wasn't going to say that was just people. That's not what I was going to say. I was going to say that I tried to empathize with that person. Like, as much as I hated it, I was just like, oh, death chair. Execution in the streets immediately. Electric chair, straight to jail. As much as that's my instinct and my predominant feeling, like, weirdly, part of me was like, I feel sorry for a person who gets to that point, because it must feel so bad to be a human being that does something so cruel. So I was able to almost empathize. It's not like I would say like...
empathy for evil is a different question, regardless of whether it's evil or not. I mean, I do think that we take this word evil, and the implication is almost that it's almost definitionally that we shouldn't have empathy for it. But I think that that's wrong. I think, again, I'm very concerned with this issue that evil is closer to us than we think. And if we don't have empathy for it, then we can't really understand it, and we can't stave it off in ourselves,
right.
because Yeah, I'm very concerned, and this was a big part of the reason why I was so defensive of Martyr Made when he got in that huge controversy over talking about World War II and the German perspective on Tucker Carlson's show.
Yeah.
And he's going to do a whole show about the German perspective. And Martyr Made, for anybody that listens to his show, is just this like immensely empathetic person. I mean, I've seen him cry on his show talking about the victims at Jonestown and, you know, how they were these good-hearted people that were extremely talented and, you know, but they got wrapped up in this cult and how terrible it was. In his series on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I mean, I just think that's the absolute best piece of material anyone can go to learn about the origins of that conflict, because he comes in with no prior biases and is just extremely empathetic to both sides. And I find that to be a very useful exercise. I mean, he is just truly one of the best at it. But how he was with Jim Jones in particular, this man who, I mean, I think you have to call that evil. But the amount of empathy and understanding that you approach that with teaches us valuable lessons for how we can fall down that path, and then enables us to prevent that. So
yeah,
I think it's evil, and I think it's important that we have empathy for Luigi.
Yeah, that's well said. I'm not going to add anything to that because you said it all. So I think that we shall wrap it up. Thank you for joining our live stream. Thank you for participating with your great comments. We enjoyed that. And subscribe.
We'll be back tomorrow. Or you'll be back tomorrow.
I will be back tomorrow. I'll be back tomorrow. And subscribe to The Black Sheep, wetheblacksheep.com, so you stay updated on the essays we're writing and my live stream schedule. And thank you for joining, and see you on the next one.